right, so the questions this week, and we are studying the fundamentals of Buddhism, our guiding book, though it's not our, we're not studying like we've studied other books where, you know, everything is from the book and we just talk about the book. And our guiding book is Thich Nhat Hanh's The Heart of Buddha's Teaching. There is an online version if you're not able to get the book to support Parallax Press. So Peter has put it in the chat. If you came on later and can't see it, Peter, can you just post it again for us? All right, so the two questions or three now that, thank you, Michelle, for yours. From last week, we're still working on trust. So what is the source of your suffering? How does this relate to trust? That was from last week. And then Michelle's add to it is trusting in our humanness the same as trusting in ourselves? I don't know if it's the same. I will say that what I'm saying as the premise for this series is that to practice is to learn to trust ourselves as humans, to trust our human experience as enough, or better yet, to trust that our human experience is well enough. As many of you, I think, have heard, lately I've been, so there's a phrase called good enough, which technically comes from psychology, Winnicott. You've heard of it, the good enough mother, coined in the late 50s in psychology to basically say that how we're raised, you know, there's not a perfect childhood. There's not a perfect parenting. So is the parenting good enough, right? Well enough. And so I've taken it to say well enough lately, because to me it takes good and bad still feels like, you know, not moralistic, but just very judgment. Whereas well enough for me gives a sense much more of like, oh, is this well enough for me? Like it's a satisfactory, which works in the sense of, remember that in Buddhism, so the Four Noble Truths, which is the basis of all Buddhist sects, right, is classically in life there is suffering. The Pali word is dukkha, D-U-K-K-H-A, which usually is translated as suffering. Other translations are dis-ease, discontent, dissatisfaction. So good enough is that sense of satisfaction. Second noble truth is, who knows what the second noble truth is? Come on. Be brave.
There are causes to suffering.
There's a cause to suffering. I didn't see who said that, but that's all right. Causes and conditions to suffering. So as many of you know, I'm developing the engage Four Noble Truths. So then the first noble truth then is, if it's a restorative model. So as a restorative model, then we go ahead and just boldly say there is suffering, or there has been suffering or harm. Excuse me, there has been harm, hurt or harm. Dukkha too. So then the second noble truth classically, traditionally, is there are causes and conditions to suffering. And that is still true in the engaged Four Noble Truths. However, we focus much more on the condition part, as in the structural. What are the, not just the personal, but the structural sense of how dukkha, dis-ease, dissatisfaction, discontent, suffering arises, hurt and harm. So for instance, you know, take the example by Peter, right? Noticing what ways that, we keep ourselves from, correct me if I'm wrong, Peter, like how you can overthink when you have disease is right, and that's the suffering. Was that basically it?
Yeah, I would say get stuck in sort of a loop
Yeah.
where you're just focusing on the problem. Yeah.
Yeah. So which works well in several ways of the second noble truth. So the sometimes people think desire is the cause of suffering, but it's not desire. It's not what is, it's the perseveration on something. So the obsessive quality that can bring is more likely to bring about dukkha. These days, what was a word I heard recently that I thought, oh, that's a good one too. Can't pull it up, but basically the obsessive energy. So it's kind of like, sure, you can want something, but when you can't take your mind off, or your whole life is directed there, and it causes you so much suffering that you can't have it, or of course the other way is that it's there and you don't want it to be, right? Then that's a cause. So, but that's very personal. So the structure would be that due to certain conditions in our life, like our parenting, family, or culture, or systems of, say, oppressions, or system of economics, or a system of ecology, we have conditions have made it that, like right now, anxiety over the climate, especially with the recent, right, that humans are the cause of this whole climate disaster that's happening. It's a natural response to have anxiety about it. So these are structural things that have brought about anxiety as a harm or a hurt. We could say that, where does it become harm on a certain level? And this is a distinction that I'll make a lot of time, not always, but the difference between hurt and harm, or as Charlotte Jokobeck would say, true suffering versus false suffering, is to what degree that we take, like anxiety with the climate is a natural response. But to perseverate on it, and to, let's say, not be able to sleep, to hate, to hoard, or go buy yourself a piece of whatever on that floating island, so that when all the ocean rises, you will be just safe, but forget everyone else. By that I don't mean if you can afford it, it's bad to do it, but just to have that sense of like, it's me, forget everyone else, right? In terms of a sense of greed about it, then that could be the difference between hurt and harm, right? You're obsessive about how you could be safe from climate change, to the extent that you would hurt others to get there, or cause other suffering to get there, or cause yourself suffering, right? Okay. Does that make sense? So conditioning gives us a much more structural. So that would be the engage. So the third noble truth is what? Classically, or you could say the engage version if you remember it.
There is cessation. There is cessation. I mean, it can come to an end. It can bring to an end.
Okay, all right. Yes, there is a cessation. It's the classic. Katie, did you have more to say about it?
I was going to add to the fourth noble truth whenever you got to that.
All right, what is that?
The fourth noble truth is that the cessation of suffering is the noble path, the eightfold noble path. I mean, the eightfold
Path. Yeah, sometimes
the eightfold truth.
the eightfold path.
The eightfold path.
Yeah, the four noble truths, the eightfold path. Sometimes it is called the noble eightfold path. So yeah, so both of those, and let's raise our hands when you want to speak. The class, that's a classic way. The cessation of it is the third noble truth, and the eightfold path is to be developed or to be practiced. Remember that in the really, according to Gil Fronsdal, who's a scholar, in the early days of Buddhism, just to practice is the fourth noble truth. And then the Eightfold Path became the structure of practice for that. So before I go into what the Eightfold Paths are, so in the Engage Four Noble Truths, so the cessation is it's based on understanding agency, right? That where is there in the midst of hurt and harm, I can do something about it, or we can do something about it structurally, or there's some kind of structural response to cease it. And some of that is based on the sense that the second noble truth, if it's conditioned, if we are conditioned on how to behave, how to react to certain situation, then we basically we are taught it, then we can unlearn it or relearn it. So it seems more hopeful in my sense. Already, actually, Thich Nhat Hanh says healing is possible. So it's just a kind of a, my way of kind of being a little clearer how I see that healing to be possible. To see where do I have the agency to unlearn what I was taught to believe or think or behave, or can I relearn it? And in some ways that's practice. We're relearning, right? We're relearning how to frame how we think, how we feel, reframing how we know ourselves. We're reframing trust in our experience. Because a lot of conditions, especially say oppressive conditions, even by that I could mean your family structure, that's a structure, right, has conditioned us to not trust our experience. I remember this somewhat related. Many years ago I worked in a battered women's shelter, right, with homeless people and then battered women's shelter. So a lot of children were present. Right? And so I remember one of the childcare people, taught me that like when you get ready to leave with children, many of us say, "Are you ready to go?" When really they don't have a choice. It's time to go, right? And so it's not very good, like very useful way of training the child that they have a choice when they really don't have a choice. Because then it's like, "You're not ready! Why aren't you ready?" And, then they're being pulled by the arm, or shoes are being shoved in their feet or whatever, or, like, "You're always like this," or something, as opposed to saying, "Tom," or "Katie, it's time to go. Please put on your shoes, let's go," right? So many of us are conditioned to think we have choice, and then we don't. So then you're like, oh, how can I trust that this is really a place that I have agency? So in some ways we're relearning where and how we can have agency. And that's the third noble truth. That's the healing part. And then the fourth is the Eightfold Path. That stays the same. And in the engaged version, I would say it's more the sense of in knowing that we're empowered. So the empowered is both an individual empowerment and, of course, a community and collective empowerment. So on a certain level, it works still, I think, with this sense of we're practicing to trust our experience, because so many systems have taught us not to trust our experience, or we have made bad choices and don't trust ourselves anymore. I actually think that so much of my practice has been, how can I learn to retrust myself? And this helps a lot when you think about the Eightfold Path, because in the Eightfold Path, where there are 8 aspects, they're broken into 3 sections. And those who have taken courses over and over, what are the 3 sections? The wisdom aspect, the ethical conduct, or I like to say compassionate conduct, and then the meditative, otherwise known as the samadhi third or aspects. The prajna, wisdom, the sila or shila, that's the Sanskrit, the ethical conduct, compassionate conduct, and then the samadhi, or the concentration practice section. Right? And so the first is two aspects, skillful view. Sama is the word for all of them. Right? The Eightfold Path is sama, what's view? Sankappa, I believe. Don't quote me on that. I can't pull it up right now. I'm pretty sure it's Sankappa. But sama here classically is translated as right. So the right as in correct, as in appropriate. I think I've shared this. If not, it's pretty funny. Recently I heard, I believe it was Thanissaro Bhikkhu, but don't quote me on that, talking about how the right in the commentaries is about, the way they describe how you know right is if you went up to a cow and your intention is to milk the cow, then it is wrong to pull on the tail to get milk. And it is right to pull on the teats to get milk, right? So this is that's why it's right in that way, as in the appropriate one to get what you're looking for, in this case, right view. In Buddhism, right view composes of two things. One is the understanding of the Four Noble Truths. Don't forget that in Buddhism, and in fact in the Four Noble Truths, you understand it as in three ways. One is you understand it intellectually, the teachings about, which in part we're doing, and then you understand it as experience, right? So this is why in part you take these questions with you home. So then some aspect of the teaching, you take it with you. And then in your experience with it in your life, you obtain the third way of understanding, or wisdom in Buddhism, which is the realization that it becomes part of your life. And in fact, the Eightfold Path, you're practicing to develop it as in it becomes a part of you. So a person who is the Eightfold Path, right, doesn't just act by the Eightfold Path, doesn't just know the Eightfold Path, but is the Eightfold Path, is enlightened in some of the commentaries, right? So then that's wisdom. So that's the Four Noble Truths, and to understand karma. Simplified as because of this, that will happen. Right? Consequence is another brief way of putting it. So, and in Buddhism, the consequence technically is to understand it not only as like this begets that in that sense, but in a long-term sense, right? When I realize that, you know, not only that if I let go of this book, it will drop, but what is the many lifetimes of the consequence of my action? So then the result of that is patience. You're willing to wait. You're willing to practice to see how this will go. And in that comes the willingness to accept mistakes. And the willingness to understand more and more clearly, oh, if I do this, right, this will happen. If I do it like with, you know, this is why it goes then to the intention of the second part of wisdom, third, which is skillful thinking classically. But the thinking in Buddhism is a purposive thinking. So another translation would be motivation or intention. So it isn't just, you know, just the thoughts I have, but because, as we well know, the thoughts we have become action. How we believe condition how we behave. thus we go from the wisdom to the morality, or the interactive part, I like to say, which is skillful. So that's the current translation I'm going with of Sama, skillful. I will say I used to use wise, right? Wise understanding, wise intention, wise speech, action, livelihood. I will say that in my discussion with Gil, wise gives us that much more sense of it's just a thought or an intellectual, whereas skillful implies both, uh, uh, a sense of it in your thinking and a sense of acting and a sense of being with, you could say. So then skillful speech, skillful action, and skillful livelihood. Livelihood here is about your job for sure, or how you make a living, but it's also about the quality of how you manifest your intention. Right? So if your livelihood is a social worker, which of course is my profession also, and so that sounds like skillful livelihood, right? Working with unhoused people, that sounds skillful. But if I was a social worker in which I think that there are problems that I need to solve, or I stereotype people, or I don't treat them well who are unhoused, or I'm not respectful. But of course, it means that not always am I, 100% skillful. But if I come from a place in which I'm better than them and I'm just helping them out, then in Buddhism that would be, you're not going to go to hell, but it's just not the most skillful or the most developed way of, being with. So it's an interaction, right? The quality of your interaction, your intention is really important. And as the more and more you practice, sometimes it is said that intention is the most important thing in Buddhism. In some commentary, it said, for instance, if you intentionally step on a bug, then that's killing, and that's very deep, deep karma, right? But if you accidentally step on a bug, then that's a lower sense of killing. Mm-hmm. However, if you, act like you're doing it unintentionally to look good, but really it was your intention, that's the very worst, right, of unskillful intention. Mm-hmm. So what am I going to? Oh, so then the third grouping is, of course, skillful effort, skillful mindfulness, and skillful concentration. These are meditative qualities that we practice. And the meditative qualities, while listed as third, is considered, as many of you know, and this is phrasing from Gil, as the bridge between all right, good night, Barbara. Between the first aspect grouping and the second. So for instance, our meditation, right? Concentration, mindfulness, and effort helps us take our values, our understanding about karma, about the Four Noble Truths, and our intention. It helps us when we're meditating. This is why our meditation isn't just like going, I'm here to be with what is, right? There is a lot of that because we're usually not present with what is. But so much of practice is actually about very much being, that's why it's called mind training, and mind and heart are the same in Buddhism. So it's a training so that you can incline your heart and mind towards skillful or wholesome or positive qualities. It doesn't deny that you have the negative, unskillful, not wise ones. However, a lot of practice is inclining towards that and knowing how to unhinge yourself, stop your obsessiveness of the unskillful, unwholesome, unuseful, sometimes I like to say, qualities. So in meditation, we both can have a sense of what our values are and how we understand the world and how we want to manifest that into our action. And then in meditation, we always say, oh, I behaved in a certain way. Is it in accordance with my values? Right? So it's a place in which we could say regulate. We regulate, or we manifest, we enact what is important to us, or we re-regulate, retrust, reconnect to when we have not been. Which goes into the part where I said that sometimes when we have made unwise choices or behave in unwise way, part of that is learning to trust ourselves again.